Hello everyone, my name is Samuel Oatley, and this is my very first BookTube video. This is a bit of a learning experience for me because I really haven't made any sort of review or really any YouTube video kind of like this. And I guess to explain why I'm doing this, I first have to kind of explain how I first got into BookTube. My first real inspiration to start doing BookTube is someone that some of you might be familiar with. It's Michael K. Vaughan. I discovered him, I think, a year or two ago, and he's basically been the only booktuber I've regularly followed. He was very interested in like the old pulp fiction and a lot of really old works from pulp writers, and I'm very much invested in that kind of writing, so he's kind of been the only main booktuber I've really followed over the last year or two. But he was kind of the one that sort of inspired me to start trying out this BookTube thing, because he really made it seem interesting and fun, and he actually had a format that I really liked that I didn't really see with any other booktubers that I watched, and he's a real big inspiration for me. And a lot of the first couple of videos you'll see from me are pretty similar to his format. Hopefully I'll discover my own format if I decide to keep going with this, but that's my main inspiration for getting into BookTube. So if you don't know who Michael K. Vaughan is, I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. You'll find a lot of good things from him. I think you'll enjoy, especially if you're into pulp fiction or just sort of older adventure writing. He's very good for that, and even just like basic science fiction and fantasy. He's really good about talking about those things, and yeah, I think if you're into that stuff, you'll very much enjoy him like I did. So Michael K. Vaughan is my main inspiration, but why did I really want to do a booktube in the first place? I think the main reason is mostly because I have a lot of books. If you look behind me, you'll see my bed, and over my right shoulder you'll see plenty of books piled on top of boxes, and even this pile of boxes right behind me on my left shoulder, that's on top of my laundry hamper. Just this whole bunch of books and films that I've collected over the years, some of which I haven't watched or read, some of them I have, but just a lot of them. And obviously I won't be talking about really movies on a BookTube channel, but I did want to talk a lot about the books because I have so many of them, and one of the biggest concerns that I know about both as a reader and as a writer is that not a lot of reviews are left on books. Like the thing that you always hear if you've gone to any sort of convention or book fair, you'll always hear authors say the exact same thing after you buy their book: please leave a review. And yeah, it's one of those things you'd think, oh yeah, that's an easy thing to do, people will do it. They really don't. Like, if you go on Amazon, you'll find books that theoretically have been bought thousands by the bunch, bought like thousands of copies, yet the reviews don't seem to match up all those copies. So I really want to help out various publishing houses and authors and sort of give my take on their books, particularly for the authors, because a lot of authors really don't get much feedback, and it can be frustrating, speaking as an author, that there's not really any feedback from your releases, and it just kind of like, yeah, you don't really know how people feel about your work, and it's just sort of like, yeah, it's not a great feeling. A lot of people say they really hate bad reviews of their work, but sometimes getting no reviews is worse because you have no clue if people love or hate it. So, well, I also wanted to talk about how did I get such a high volume of books? Well, it kind of came in three phases. The first was in college, I really got into crowdfunding. Kickstarter, Indiegogo, later Fund My Comic. But I kind of like this idea of like independent financing of one's own books because it took a lot of the middleman out. You didn't have to necessarily worry about what a publisher or what an editor thinks from a big publishing house. And if you've been following a lot of publishing news, you know that the publishing houses are kind of diminishing in their popularity and even in their financial returns. Like, you don't get as many like $200,000 book deals like you might have gotten in the 80s or 90s. It just is not as recurring a thing unless you're a real big person. So I really got into the indie crowdfunding scene, and I got a lot of indie comic books and books. So I really wanted to, as I said earlier, I wanted to help out authors by providing reviews, and especially crowdfunded authors who maybe don't get reviews because their stuff isn't necessarily published on big platforms. Like there's plenty of things I've crowdfunded that do not appear on Amazon or any bookseller sites. So again, that's kind of a way of helping crowdfunded authors know what people think about their work. I also, shortly after that, I discovered Hamilton Books. And Hamilton Books is this huge, I guess you could call it outlet, who does a lot of price cut books. Like, they buy books in bulk and they sell them for very cheap prices. And some of them are well-known popular books, and they're really not all that much cheaper than what's on Amazon. They might be a couple dollars cheaper. But then there's some that are significantly lower than what's on Amazon or Abe Books or any other retailers. So I really got into them, especially for a couple of old comic books and comic book reissues that are kind of hard to find or not as easy to get a reasonable price on. So that also kind of caused a boom in my book collection. And the third thing was kind of a personal tragedy. I'm not going to go too into it, but my mother passed away a couple of years ago, and I didn't really buy all that much stuff even after I discovered crowdfunding in Hamilton. But after my mother passed, it was kind of like I started buying a lot of books and movies, and it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision. It wasn't like, oh, I'm sad, I'm going to buy a bunch of stuff. It was just kind of a thing that started, and I didn't really realize how much I was buying until like 2 years later. I was looking at what money I had left over. I'm like, oh yeah, I spent way more on these than was probably reasonable. So I kind of wanted to go through a lot of those books that I bought during that period and basically read through them and basically get them off my chest. Because I also inherited a fair number of books from my mother, stuff that she had that she either never read or read and kind of put away. And I really wanted to go through those too. So it's just it being a cascading level of events where things build up and books keep building up. And I still buy a fair number of books because sometimes it's stuff I'm legitimately interested in, because the more stuff I've read, the more things I become interested in, and it just kind of keeps going up from there. So this BookTube channel is partially a sorting channel, essentially, sorting out the books I really do want to keep and the ones that can be gotten rid of. They're not really that important or interesting. So that's the main reason all these books that you see have kind of built up. But the other reason I kind of wanted to do this BookTube thing was I'm aware that there are a number of booktubers who do this already, but I wanted to talk about writing as well as books, because I actually am a trained writer, a professional trained writer. Not a whole lot of published things, but I am published. And from my understanding, a lot of other booktubers do this too, but I'm also kind of trying to walk through this as a writer who is gaining ideas from what he reads. Like, basically, as I read and talk about these books, basically talking about what I sort of glean from them and what I might sort of take to do in my own work. Ideas they may provoke that I'll sort of take and do for my own stories. Because I think a lot of writers are kind of hesitant to talk about that, because they'll like list broad things that they're inspired by, but not really specific things. I think some of it's probably legalese things, because you don't necessarily want to say, oh yeah, I got this idea, and someone say, oh, you took this from me, I can sue you. But I think it's also a thing of sometimes you get ideas from a work and you don't necessarily act on them. Like some idea, like, oh, this is a great idea. Then you kind of go, well, no, that's actually not that good an idea. But I really want to talk about the stories I read and see if they really inspire me to write any stories of my own, and what they really help with in the creative process. And also, since I'm approaching these book analyses as a writer as well as a reader, I also really want to kind of talk about the things in these stories that I review and look at them at what works and what doesn't, like what the writer is trying to do, that as a writer I recognize the tactic and explain why this works or why this doesn't work, and just sort of explain what they're doing. Excuse me. So this is going to be sort of a discussion of writing as well as reading. As you can probably tell, if you've sat through this long in the video, this is not going to be a very professional setup. I have a single camera with a microphone attached. That's why I'm sitting so close to the camera, because I have a microphone that can pick me up at a decent distance, but for some reason the app I have will not record in tandem with the camera, so I have to use the microphone that's in the camera. So this is all going to be very much an amateur setup, and I'm basically going to be freewheeling throughout a lot of this journey. And there's not going to be like any bookshelf tours or anything. It's going to be very simplistic and straightforward. The ideas I talk about are going to be the main ideas of the video, and there's not going to be much aesthetically interesting things that maybe some other videos might have. So just be aware of that, and don't expect me to have like Michael K. Vaughan has his Mummy Roger hanging behind him. You're not going to get much aesthetics out of me. Hopefully that's permissible on BookTube, but just wanted to let everyone know. So some of you might be saying, well, you're a professional writer. What's your background? And my background really starts with my education. I went through college at Daytona State College, which is actually the shirt I have right now. Daytona State College. Got a Bachelor in Arts. Then I went to the University of Central Florida and got a bachelor's in English. Took a year off from school, partially to get out of school, see how I felt in the job market. Then I realized it's nicer to be in school. So I went back to UCF to get my master's in fine arts and creative writing. And it was during my earning my master's that I kind of grew more disillusioned with traditional literary fiction. And by that I mean, the general Western canon. Like that whole idea of like the high literature that all English students and creative writing students are supposed to know about and treat and venerate with great desire. But it was kind of a thing that I think my opinion at the time was that literary fiction was becoming a little too cloistered. It felt like the exact same things were being talked about in each story, and there was kind of this push to be aware of the old masters, but not necessarily run after them. They really were pushing modern literary fiction, which is a noble enough goal, but it's kind of a thing. There were sort of trends at the time that it felt like every, literary, and when I say literary, I mean like high literary status folks were really trying to do, and it just kind of felt stifling to me. I grew up as a science fiction fan, and science fiction was all about like expanding your horizons, going to interesting ideas beyond what we currently know. So that was kind of making me a little weary of trying to go do the literary artist sort of route that most people were going through, as well as the teaching route. Like in Masters of Fine Arts, they really wanted to have us become teachers in the English department, and that's not really my thing. I'm not really into teaching. So, but around this time, and actually around the time of the pandemic started, I started really getting into pulp fiction. Not the movie, the genre, or maybe more accurately, the wave of pulp fiction, or the medium of pulp fiction. And I was just researching all this stuff about pulp fiction from the 1920s to the 1940s, and just sort of finding myself more interested in that format of writing. And I say format, and I was gonna say genre, but it wasn't just one genre. Pulp Fiction is not a genre. It was multiple genres told with a very unique style. And so I really started getting into that, particularly the Shadow. I managed to buy a lot of Shadow reprints from Sanctum Press right before Condé Nast took their license away, and they gave it to James Patterson, which was a huge mistake because James Patterson has not really done well by the Shadow. But getting back to the main thing, I started really getting into the Pulp Fiction. I kind of realized I was more interested in writing those kinds of direct, pulpy ideas instead of the more, like, contemplative stuff of the traditional literary writers from both the past and the then current day. So, and shortly after I got into Pulp Fiction, I started really researching a lot about the Shadow, and I discovered a magazine called the Shadowed Circle magazine that had recently started at that time, and they were asking for a web manager because they needed a web manager to help their online presence. And the Shadowed Circle was focused on nonfiction articles about the pulp hero The Shadow. And I was fairly familiar with him. I'd not read that many pulps, but I had listened to a fair number of the radio. I'd seen like the 1994 movie with Alec Baldwin. So I contacted them and at the Shadowed Circle, and I actually got the job for being their web manager. And because of that, I managed to get a lot more information about the Shadow because not only from the articles that were submitted to the magazine that I had to help proofread, but also just sort of behind the scenes information that maybe was not talked about in public or was just sort of scattered information from different sources. So that was very handy that I got into that. And I believe it was about 2 years ago, I started a podcast about another pulp hero. This time, this character was the Domino Lady, and she was one of the few pulp heroines that really popped up. And she was kind of unique in the sense that she was actually very controversial for her day because she was actually a very openly sensual character. Because obviously you have plenty of women from that era, especially in pulp magazines. They were usually more willing to dip into sensuality than the main slicks were. But the Domino Lady was actually from a very unique magazine that emphasized a lot of sensuality, and she was actually very complex, and not necessarily in a way people thought, but it wasn't necessarily deep writing, but she was a much more nuanced character than a lot of people gave her credit for. So when I really got into her, I started the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast, which I'll also link in the description. And so I've just kind of been taking in a lot of pulp characters and pulp ideas for the last 5-6 years, and I've really fallen in love with the pulp history, as well as folks who are trying to continue the ideas of pulp in the modern day. So, refreshing. So what about my actual writing? My writing background is, in college I specialized in fiction, because that's what I wanted to do. And I kind of found nonfiction interesting, but it didn't. You're always sort of constrained by the truth. Uh, though apparently there were some creative nonfiction writers who maybe exaggerated a bit. So, but I wanted to focus on fiction. And though the irony is that I've actually published more nonfiction than fiction, a couple of the nonfiction has been for the Shadowed Circle, because they offered a couple article places for me, and I took them up on that. I also have done an academic article regarding My Little Pony. I kind of dabbled in the fandom for a bit, the Brony fandom for a bit, and I had sort of information about ideas around the show, and I was familiar about it. And in my master's year, I saw this like ad that one of my professors had shared, and it was about it was a weirdly specific premise. They wanted articles talking about the cultural elements of father figures in cartoon shows, in animated shows, father figures in animated shows. And it was such an absurdly specific topic that nobody else in my class that I was aware of ever submitted to it. It was like, and it was such a weird thing. But I managed to do a thesis statement that apparently really intrigued the main lady running that project, and it was all about father figures in My Little Pony. And it was kind of a strange experience because I had to write it out, and it took like 2 or 3 years to come out because it was an academic article, and people had to go through it and evaluate and make sure what I wrote was correct and substantial. But it was very interesting. And I was the only one. I looked at all the writers, the other contributors to that project, and it was only everybody else had a master's or a doctorate in cultural studies, and there I was at the time. Only thing I had by the time the book out was master's in creative writing, not in cultural studies. So that was kind of a funny thing. But I have published fiction. In fact, my first real fiction publication was a Western. Western stories, I think, are very important to the American artistic movement, because Westerns are a very uniquely Americana story. They're not really seen in any other culture, at least not to the same way that we are. You know, there's plenty of stories about ancient journeys, but the Western has very unique tropes and ideas. So I eventually published a Western story in a magazine called Go West. It was in their second issue. I'm going to talk about that magazine sometime in the future, as they have a lot of interesting ideas and stories. But that'll be for a future video. So, given the fact how often I mention it, you can probably tell that this channel is mainly going to focus on pulp fiction. And that includes history of pulp fiction and just actual pulp fiction. So that is going to probably be the main focus of this channel. But there are a lot of other genres that I really do want to focus on. One would be historical writing, both fictional and non-fictional, because I really like reading about the history of things and seeing both like non-fiction historical documents and fictional stories that utilize a historical background. I find both of those very fascinating, so you'll probably see a fair number of that. There's going to be a lot of The Shadow. I'm a big fan of The Shadow, in case you can tell from the fact that I work for a magazine devoted to him. You'll also see lots of comic books and manga. I was a fan of comic books for a long time as a kid. I've grown more appreciative over the several years that have followed. So, and I didn't really get into manga until like college, but there's a lot of manga I find really interesting, so we'll probably talk about that. I'll also do just general fantasy and science fiction, because one thing I kind of learned from the history of pulp fiction is that fantasy and science fiction are actually very intertwined. They have a very strong connection to each other, and they really kind of come from the same place, at least in terms of like literary history. Because even in the old pulp magazines and like the early science fiction stories, there actually was not as thick a delineation between fantasy and science fiction. There's a lot of really old sci-fi pulp stories that you could honestly do as a fantasy and are almost to the point that they are just science fantasy more than they are science fiction. So I'm really kind of curious in those kind of genres, that sort of early genre stuff where fantasy and science fiction were more commingled instead of having a clear delineation like they do today. And I'm not sure I'll do this right off. I'll probably save this, but I might dip into some political books to read them, because I'm kind of going through a weird period where I'm not entirely sure about my politics. So I may read some political books just to see how I feel. But that's only if I get comfortable with BookTube. If I don't, I'm not going to do a political journey online. And these days, where politics are so fraught with peril that, you know, people get really mad about not even big things, just like small things. So it's like, yeah, that'll be something further down the line if it ever happens. So, in terms of videos you can expect soon, I will say I'm probably going to do a Black Friday and Christmas book haul video, talking about the books that I got on Black Friday and the ones that I got for Christmas. The Black Friday ones I'm waiting on, just because I actually bought some stuff for Black Friday that actually have not shown up yet. So it's kind of that thing of, well, if I do a Black Friday haul video, I'm going to have to wait for a bit. So I also am going to do an announcement about firm plans for 2026, because I've started categorizing sort of, not quite shows, I would say, but more themes of things, because there are more specific themes than just like pulp writing or comic books. I do have ideas for what I want to do. So I'll do a video about my 2026 plans here soon. There's also going to be a BookTube reading event. If you follow Michael K. Vaughan, you probably know which one I'm talking about, but I'm going to participate in that. I'm going to list out the books I want to read for that reading event, so you can expect that. I'm also going to make a sister channel to this one, but it's going to be a cinema channel that focuses on movies and television. the name of the channel is still working. Is still a working title. I was probably going to call it something like Shady Sam Silver Screen. But we'll see if I find a better name for that. So, but yeah, so thank you to anyone who watches this. I know this video's gone on a while. It's kind of been freewheeling, but I very much wanted to introduce myself to BookTube and see if there was anybody out there who shared my interests and just kind of parse the waters, see what's going on this end. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope I can get some new videos out to you soon, and hopefully this jaunt on BookTube will be lots of fun and productive. So, all right. Thank you very much. Bye.